Good evening. I'm really glad to get the chance to speak before you tonight, and it's my sincere desire that the things I've been preparing for and thinking about recently are going to be, as I present them tonight, something that's helpful for you. And to go ahead and get started, there's a lot of material. I want to go through it really quick. I'm going to put it up on the screen if you want to take notes or just follow along that way. But I'm going to be moving through some passages really quick, so just kind of be ready to get to them as we go through them. So the first thing I want to present tonight is a would you rather question. And this starts off with some things Jesus has said. And the first thing is found in Matthew chapter 16, if you want to go ahead and be looking over there. In Matthew 16, Jesus is posing a choice question. He says, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works." So this question is posed, what would you rather have? Would you rather be able to say that I've enjoyed the things of the world, I've gotten to get them and acquire them, I've really been able to enjoy it, I've been able to get the whole world? Does that sound more appealing to you? Or the option, would you rather have your own soul? What would you give up for your soul? And a second question is, would you rather have a temporary life, one that runs out, or would you rather have an abundant life, one that will keep persisting and that you'll keep able to enjoy good things? Look over in John chapter 10. In this section, Jesus is going to describe himself as a door that people have to come through to find rest, to find what he describes as pasture in verse 9. And you think, well, sheep going to pasture, they need that. They need that sustenance. They need that nourishment. They need a place that they know their needs are going to be met. But he says, I'm the door. If you go by me, you can find that. And then in verse 10, he says, I come that they may have life and they may have it more abundantly. So I'll go ahead and throw this question out. We have a choice between seeking after the things of the world, seeing what the world can offer us, that we can gain from the world, but we also have the choice of something better that goes beyond this world that can only be found in Jesus Christ. And so the topic of tonight is going to be talking about life under the sun, and it's going to be based in the book of Ecclesiastes. If you want to go ahead and be turning over there, I'd really recommend putting a bookmark there, maybe right in chapter 1, because we might leave the book a few times, but most of the passages are going to be coming from Ecclesiastes. And so whatever you see on the screen, the chapter references, verses, assume that's from Ecclesiastes as well, unless it states otherwise. But to give a little context, what you have is the King Solomon. He's one of the most powerful men of Israel, one of the most powerful kings. It says he's the wealthiest king up to his time. He has what I think a theme question, or I guess a thesis kind of question in his book would be, like, what good things does life have to offer? If you could go and explore things, I want to know what's the real reward in life. What good things can I do? And at the end of my life, I would say, this was really worth it. This was what was really important. This is what I should hold on to and consider really precious. And so we start in chapter 1, and the first passage I wanted to check out is verses 5 through 7. He starts describing the earth and how the way of its life, it just keeps going. He's saying the sun also rises, the sun goes down. This is Ecclesiastes 1, verse 5. It hastens to the place where it rose. So the sun is always going through its cycle, says that's not going to change. Verse 6, the wind goes toward the south and turns around to the north. The wind whirls about continually and comes again on its circuit. So the wind has its own course that it goes on, and it keeps perpetuating itself. All the rivers run to the sea, yet the sea is not full. It's an interesting thing to consider. It's like the sea's always getting more, but it never gets to a point where it's just going to say, well, I've had enough, and the rivers say, okay, we're not going to be flowing anymore. There's always more to be had. It says that the sea's not full to the place from which the rivers come. There they return again. But besides that, the earth continuing. Man does not. Man comes and goes. As it says in verse 4, one generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. So you kind of have a problem already presented that this cycle on earth sort of keeps going on, but we don't. We'll come, and then we'll get replaced by another group of people. And then we have this problem in verses 7 and 8. Just like the seas are never filled up by the water flowing into them, in verse 8, it says, all things are full of labor, men cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. So we too can always be receiving things. We can be looking for new things. We can be listening for new things. We want more experiences in our life. And he's saying man is never going to be satisfied with that. We always want more, just like that sea that's getting the water. And then finally, our desires and the kind of pursuits we engage in, even though technology may differ and maybe the way we talk differs and dresses and culture, we're still doing the same kinds of things that everyone's done before us. And he says in verse 9, that which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. And in verse 11, let's skip there. There's no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. So we all want to chase after things. We all have desires and pursuits we want to undertake, but that's not new to us. Everyone who's lived before us, they've done the same thing, and people who are going to come after us are going to do the same thing, except the things that we go after, they're going to be forgotten, just like we don't remember what people before us were going after. So he kind of paints what may seem like an abysmal sort of picture. And this sermon, though, it's not intended just to be pessimistic, anything along that lines. But this lesson aims to explore the pitfalls that men often fall into in life, the kind of pursuits that we go after that will ultimately not fulfill us, that will not accomplish the purpose of why we are here. And that's why I started with those two passages about what Jesus said. We have to understand a heavenly perspective, a heavenly purpose, so that as we have to go through life, we don't go after the wrong things and try to chase the wrong things that are not going to satisfy or fulfill or even destroy us. So, if we move on, I want to talk about some vanities. I got 3 in mind, and the first one is the pursuit of pleasure and accomplishments, if you want to be looking in chapter 2. But with these vanities, as he says something's vain, he's not going to say, well, you shouldn't engage in it at all, you shouldn't do it at all. Just saying if you want to see what the ultimate reward is, there's really not ultimately a good reward from it. So looking in chapter 2, I want to pick out a few verses in the first 11. Start in verse 1, Ecclesiastes 2. He said, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore, enjoy pleasure. But surely this also was vanity. I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish? I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for all the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their life. So he wants to pursue, he wants to figure out what's really good for us to be up to while we're here. What should we be going after? And I want to make a little list here of some of the things that he talks about. He's saying these are some of the great things I've been able to accomplish and attain. One is houses. In verse 4, he said he made his works great. He built houses, and I think that's a cool thing. I like to imagine, one day if I had a house, I would like it to be like this. If I could make my own house, it would be so enjoyable. If I could live in this kind of place, it would be really satisfying and fulfilling. He got to do that, except he made multiple houses. And he had beautiful sights to behold. In verse 5, he said, I made myself gardens and orchards. I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. People love going to look around in nature and to have beautiful foliage outside their house and things of that. And that's good. That's what he did as well. And he probably took it to a bigger extreme than we did, though. And also, he had enjoyable food and drink. He said he planted himself vineyards. In verse 4, in verse 5, he mentioned fruit trees that he made, just to know that he could go get something enjoyable if he wanted it. And, back in the ancient time, there wasn't Coca-Cola, Mountain Dew, 7-Up, and all that. If you're going to drink something besides water or milk, you had wine. And so that's how you got a hold of it. You had to have a vineyard. And along with that, he has these fruit trees. I think it would be cool to go outside and just say, I feel like having a nice snack. I'm going to choose from these fruit trees and figure out which one I want. That kind of lifestyle where it's sort of self-sustaining and you can look at what you've accomplished, look at all these things I've set up, these good things I've accomplished, it would be very satisfying, you'd imagine. And then, not to forget about his wealth, in verse 7 and 8, he says, I acquired male and female servants and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of the provinces. I acquired male and female singers. And just to stop there for a second, just to consider, wow, wouldn't you like for someone to have to wait on you hand and foot? He didn't have to worry about all the shrubbery for his gardens. He could have someone take care of that for him. He didn't have to worry about the dishes or whatever. Someone could take care of that. And a lot of people would think if I had the kind of wealth where I wouldn't have to worry about bad things, I could just have people wait on me, that would be really satisfying. And notice how he said male and female singers too. Just to say I can have live music whenever I want. You probably heard live music's better than the recorded thing. Depends on the singer or the groups, the artists, But as a general rule, if you're hearing some quality work, you get so much more out of it in person. He had that. He had his own singers he could go and listen to. And also, in verse 8, it says in the New King James Version, the delights of the Son of Men, but practically like every other version there mentions like a harem. He had concubines and things of that nature, talking about sexual pleasure. And you don't have to just go here. You could look in 1 Kings 11 and verse 3, and it talks about how Solomon had hundreds of wives, concubines, things of that nature. And just thinking like, if you had 1,000 people you could choose from to enjoy that with, that would be him. A lot of people think that's what life's all about. If I could just have that, man, I would have everything. I would be made. I would be set. I would be happy. But I just want you to take a look at that list because it's a pretty pertinent one, I think, that a lot of people set themselves up to try to accomplish, at least some of these things. But look at the conclusions he makes about these things. In verse 1, he describes pleasure, this pursuit, as vanity or futility. Like, ultimately, it didn't end up doing me any good. And in verse 11, he says, he looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed, all was vanity and grasping for the wind. That's this idea of trying to strive after the wind, to grasp it. You can feel the wind when it comes by, but could you imagine trying to catch it? It's like, I'm going to get it. And so it's there for the moment, and you try to obtain it, but then it's gone. You lost it. So it's like the itch you can't scratch. It's something you're trying to get, but it always gets away from you. It's like, he says this whole pursuit, trying to acquire all these things to find that lasting fulfillment, it was like striving after the wind, trying to grasp the wind. And in verse 11, the ultimate conclusion, if you could just look at his life and say, I've got to enjoy all these pleasurable things, and I've had all these great accomplishments. He ultimately says, there is no profit under the sun. What good does it really do for me in the end that I've done all these things? He says there's no profit for it. So along with all these vanities, I don't just want to talk about how they're vain. Going back to what we read originally, I want us to help put these things in a proper perspective. Logan talked about seeing God. All these things we got to do in life, we have to remember God. And so a couple of perspectives to offer. One is that pleasure, we should enjoy it within God's boundaries. If you look over in chapter 9 of Ecclesiastes and start in verse 7, he says, "Go, eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works." So to say, you should enjoy the food you're eating and drink your drinking, but it's on that basis, he says God's accepted your works. Sure, enjoy pleasure if you know that God is looking on what you're doing and he's pleased with it. You should just go ahead. And also, look at chapter 11 in verse 9. He says, "Rejoice, O young men, in your youth. Let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment." So it's okay to have desires that we want to go after and pursuits that we want to undertake. It wasn't wrong for Solomon to plant a vineyard or, to make a garden or whatever. But at the same time, we have to understand that whatever we choose to do, God is going to look at and judge it. So we have to be careful to rein in our desires and make sure they're going to be pleasing in his sight, acceptable to him. And finally, a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. We can look at a lot of these things that we were just talking about and saying, well, they may not inherently be wrong, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't necessarily think about what we're doing. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12, Paul said, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. Foods for the stomach, and the stomach for foods, but God will destroy both it and them. Now the body is not for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. So just because we can see some things like, well, it's okay to be happy, it's okay to enjoy good meals and think I want those kind of experiences, but at the same time, we have to understand the perspective. Our life's not all about just enjoying good things, though. There's more to life than that. God's going to get rid of the stomach one day. Life's not all about eating a good meal. And it's not all about sexual immorality, because our body's going to be destroyed one day, too. So we need to enjoy pleasure within God's boundaries. And also, we don't need to let the pursuit of pleasure blind us from considering our end. So let's go back to Ecclesiastes again. And I want you to turn to chapter 7. This is a humbling chapter. It's always weighed a lot on me. It really helps put things in perspective about our own end. In chapter 7, verse 1, he says, a good name is better than precious ointment. And you think ointment can help ease pains and things like that. He says a good name is better than that. The day of death than the day of one's birth. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. So just stop in there for a second to consider this. He's saying we would do well to consider our end, the end of every man. And at times we may think, I don't want to be around thinking about death. When you hear about maybe someone losing someone, you may think, oh, that's going to make me sad. And that's going to maybe put a damper on my mood. Well, the thing is, he says, you need to consider that. You need to consider that one day you need to take this to heart and say, well, that's going to be the end of all men. That's going to be the end of me one day. So I should be there. And then in verse 5, you take this kind of mentality seriously to say, if I'm thinking about my end, I'm going to be living my life in a better way. For example, if I hear a wise person rebuke me, I would rather have that. I'd rather feel the pain of being rebuked than to hear the song of fools. So instead of entertaining myself and forgetting about God, I'm going to get my life in perspective and hear the things I need to hear. I'm going to take in the wisdom I need to hear to make sure I'm pleasing in God's sight and not just try to entertain all my problems away. So we don't need to let pleasure blind us from really thinking about, hey, we're going to end one day. We're going to be just like that person in the casket. We have to keep that kind of perspective in mind. And then in chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes, he also says in verse 1, remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them. There's a lot of pleasure to be enjoyed, while you're in the days of your youth. You think you got all this energy and you feel maybe really motivated. Oh, all the possibilities are endless. But, it's what he describes is that in verse 3, the keepers of the house tremble, the strong men bow down, and those who look through the windows grow dim. It's like people are kind of starting to lose their senses. They can't see and hear as well. They can't, they're not strong as they used to be. And so if you think life's all about the pursuit of pleasure, what's going to happen when you start getting older and things just aren't as pleasurable as they used to be? That's kind of the question he's posing. Do you want to be like that person where you thought, my life is all about enjoying pleasurable things, but then you get to the point where you're not really enjoying as much? You're going to be a really bitter person at that point. And you're going to think, well, what was the point of all my life? I just wasted it. Now I have nothing to enjoy. So we don't need to wait. We need to consider our end now and be remembering our Creator while we have time to. So this is our first vanity we've talked about, the pursuit of pleasure. Another vanity is prioritizing work and wealth. Look over in chapter 9 in verse 10. To clarify, he does say, whatever your hands find to do, do it with your might. For there's no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you are going. It's like this is your one chance to be in this life. And if you have work that's unique to earth, you might as well do it well. Why would you want to be known for whatever you do a horrible job at it? Honestly, I wish I remembered that more in high school and college. Guys up here, to think, well, it's just school. It doesn't matter. It's not a big deal. Well, whatever you do, you should try to do it well. He does make that point. And also, the fruit of our work, the wealth that we get, like if you look in chapter 5, verses 19 and 20, it says we should enjoy that. It says, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart. So is it wrong to enjoy the fruit of your labor? If you made a lot of money with your job, if you come across some wealth, it's not wrong to enjoy that. In fact, it's saying this is God's gift to you. You should enjoy that. Now, I just want to do that to kind of help put in perspective. Not just because it's a vanity doesn't mean we shouldn't be engaged or doing it. And so let's go on from there. Look at chapter 5 now in verses 10 and 12. Here it says, he who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. So if you're the kind of person that loves the feeling of getting more money, and you start basing your life around, how can I get more money? It's saying, well, for one, you're not going to be satisfied when you get more. It turns out that those super rich CEOs, they don't finally say, finally, I made enough profit. I don't want any more. There's always the next level. There's always the next step. I got to push further. I got to get a little more. It says this is a vanity. And also in verse 11, when goods increase, they increase who eat them. So I just always imagine a lottery winner. If for some reason you're in the lottery and then you get the $300 million, mega ball, whatever it's called, you get that. What's going to happen? Well, for one, everyone's going to become your friend all of a sudden, and they're going to want a little bit and say, remember me? You need to hand some of that over. And then the charities are going to come and say, you're a wealthy person now. You need to be generous with that wealth and help us out. And, you do have some responsibility in those ways. But he's saying when goods increase, they increase who eat them. So it's kind of a paradoxical thing. I've made my life about pursuing getting more money. But now that I got more money, I got to give more of it away. Saying that's kind of a vanity. So what profit have the owners except to see their wealth with their eyes? Again, if you take the end of your life and you think about all the money you've heaped up, what good is it going to do you in the end except to say, well, it was kind of nice to look at that I had all that. A person that dies with $1 million in their banking account as opposed to $0, it doesn't change their fate. It's not going to ultimately profit them in that way. So we shouldn't become enthralled in the pursuit of wealth. But also, we should remember that we can lose our wealth and that we will lose it. Look in verse 13. He says, there is a severe evil which I've seen under the sun, riches kept for their owner to his hurt. One is that, people can hurt themselves just by how much they amass. It can actually stress them out and make their life hard. But also in verse 14, but those riches perish through misfortune. When he begets a son, there's nothing in his hand. And I think other versions there say maybe through a bad investment, he lost some of his riches. When the stock market crashed, there was a lot of money that people lost. It says money can be like a little bird that flies away. We might think we have security, but we got to understand things can happen and that money can just leave us in an instant. Maybe it's like the value of the U.S. dollar just suddenly crashing or something. Who knows what could happen? But then in verse 15, it's not just that we could lose it. Think about this. It says, as he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return, to go as he came. And he shall take nothing from his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. And this also is a severe evil. Just exactly as he came, so shall he go. And what profit has he who has labored for the wind. All his days he also eats in darkness, and he has much sorrow and sickness and anger. So some people who are willing to go through so much pain to try to amass a lot of money, to try to get super high in their career. And that's also kind of why I put that picture up there. I don't know how well you can see it, but there's a guy that has to go through these tires. He has to jump through this flaming hoop because I'm going to get that job. That's what I'm all about. And it just he's sort of posing the question, how much pain are you willing to go through for that? And if so, what's the point ultimately? If that's the pursuit of your life, if that's the reason you're here, just think about you're spending all your life in misery, or not necessarily all of it misery, but a lot of pain and concern. How am I going to get up higher? How am I going to get more money? And it can do a lot of harm for someone. And then we have to lose it all anyways. Just like we came to the world with nothing, we got to give it all back. So no matter how much you earn, it doesn't matter because you got to give it all back. Someone else takes it. And so that's that sort of the downer he presents. Maybe I shouldn't make my life all about that. Maybe there's something else to life besides the acquisition of wealth. Another perspective is that in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 21, it says, "For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill." So imagine you're doing something, you have some job, you're doing it really well. You're setting a good precedent for everyone to come after you. You're making things the way they should be. But then, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and great evil. So no matter what you pour into your job, eventually someone's going to take over. And the emphasis is going to be on that person. And then, if we keep looking on in the next two verses, it says, "For what has a man for all of his labor," verse 22, "and for the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, his work burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity." So just thinking about it, if your life is all about work, and you're going to have to give your work over to someone else, why are you going through it? All the pain that's going to cause. And here's a couple things I want to bring up. If we're going through this, if we're going to understand the pain associated with hard work, we should understand the reason we're doing it. There's got to be a good reason for it. And the first thing I want to ask, is it the love of money? Is that your driving force? I'm just going to paraphrase 1 Timothy chapter 6. I do encourage you to check out that passage, though. But it talks about how we should be content with what we have. Kind of says similar things of what we've already read about not being able to take anything out of the world. Actually, I think I'm going to misspeak something about it. So I will turn there. But 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 7. Yeah, look at verse 8, or I'll just read that. "And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into a temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition." So it's like leaving contentment and thinking, I'm not going to be content because I need more money. Saying that's a horrible way to be. Not only are you going to make your life miserable, you're going to get yourself in destruction. You're going to ruin yourself. He says, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." So again, do you want the life here, or do you want the life after this life, the eternal abiding life? People will ruin themselves for a little bit of wealth to enjoy in this life here. But it's so sad to see that they will give up the next life that's better just for this one. Another possibility, why are we doing all this labor, is it to rival others? So back in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, he says in verse 4, "Again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind." I think the New American Standard talks about the skill and work as a result of rivalry between neighbors. But whatever the case may be about how that phrase should be, just think, are you doing what you're doing? Do you have the job you have and the work you're doing just because you want to be a little better than someone else? Or you want to make someone kind of envious of what you have? Is it that I want my car to be a little better than everyone else's car? I want my house to be a little nicer than everyone else's. Saying this is a vanity. Life shouldn't be about us trying to one-up people, and that shouldn't be the point of our work. That's a miserable perspective to have. But some perspectives that I do think will be helpful is one, that we work with a perspective towards God. Look over in Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 23. It says, "Whatever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ." So if we have a work perspective that's focused on we work hard because we're trying to please the Lord, it puts a little more sense to why we're going through what we're going through. And also, in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28, I'm just going to read that verse by itself. It says, "Let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to give him who has need." So another reason to work, instead of just being about self and benefiting self, it's about, well, how can I help other people? I have this gift from God. Maybe I can help someone who really needs it. And that's another good reason to be working. And then I mentioned Luke chapter 12, verse 16, and going through 21. That's a parable about Jesus mentioning this rich man, and as he's sowing and planting crops, he's getting a better and better increase, more than he expected, and he realizes, I don't have room for all this stuff. What am I going to do? It's like, well, I got an idea. In verse 18, he says, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take up your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." Like, finally, I've got it made. I got all this stuff now. I can be happy. I'm set for life. But there's one problem. In all this, though, he's not thinking about God. He's thinking about himself, his security for himself, but he's not thinking about God. He's thinking about his own wealth in this life. Because in verse 20, God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." So if we work with this perspective toward God and think, well, I can get money, that's fine. I need to use it for things, but I need to be doing this for God. Not just saying I need to build up myself and make myself some kind of rich, great person. Because if you do that, we'll lose it, and then where's our soul going? We have to consider those things. Also, we need to be content in having the Lord. The 1 Timothy passage was actually mentioned earlier and read there, but I think that verse goes back to answering this point as well. And then in Philippians chapter 4, we can read about the way Paul could handle different situations involving how much money he had. In Philippians chapter 4, in verse 11, Paul says, "Not that I speak in regard to need, for I've learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I've learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need." So no matter what state he was in, no matter how much he had, he could still be content. Why? In verse 13, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." He had confidence and strength in the Lord, and that's why he could deal with those different situations. That's why he could be content even if he didn't have a lot. He could be content too if he was wealthy. So we need to keep that in mind. And then in Hebrews chapter 13, in verse 5, I may end up paraphrasing it if I can't flip to it fast enough. But in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5, it says, "Let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you." So again, what we have is what we have. And we should be content with it. It's a blessing of God. But beyond just what we have, we should know those things are going to only last for this life. God is going to last beyond this life. So we should be more content in knowing that we have God. If we are in right standing with God, that will go beyond this life. That will be worth more than having the things of this world. So this is the second vanity we talked about, prioritizing our work and wealth over seeking God. And we talked about the first one, the pursuit of pleasure. Now I got one more I want to talk about, and that's the uncertain and unfair nature of life. Because we might look at those first two and be like, well, yeah, those things are really selfish. I get why people aren't going to go after that. But I think this one kind of messes with people a little more, to be honest with you. I think this is one we worry about a lot more. And so you should go back to Ecclesiastes, because we're going to be there for a little while, if you're not already flipped back. So in chapter 1, verse 15, he has such an interesting way of describing the problems of life. He says, what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. Have you ever seen things in life and said, they shouldn't be this way? This shouldn't have happened like this. And you imagine, this looks like this. I should have straightened, this should be looking like this instead. And if you look up there, I don't know if you can see it, I put a picture of two goldfish in a bowl, and one of those, you know something's not quite right there. It's like, why does that big goldfish have such a little bowl? That bigger goldfish should be in that bigger bowl, and that little tiny one's in that giant bowl. Why does it have all that? That's not right. Well, that's one of the things I want to use as an illustration. There's going to be a lot of things that aren't quite right in life. And it says what's lacking cannot be counted. The things that you can find out that, should be, or you think it should be one way in life, saying there's going to be a lot of those. You couldn't count all the ones that are going to happen. And look over in chapter 7. Because we may think, well, I get that there's a lot of things wrong with life, but, if I just try to live a really good life and I try to live wisely, then I'm not going to have to go through, such bad things. And in verse 11 of chapter 7, it says, wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable to those who see the sun, for wisdom is a defense, as money is a defense. But the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. So you think, well, I can avoid a lot of pitfalls of life in being wise. That's true. And you could also think, if I have some money, I don't know. I'm just imagining random natural disasters happen. Oh, there's some money for that. The fridge stops working, dishwasher. Oh, there's some money for that. Car breaks down. If you have some money, you can help alleviate some of those problems. But we should also see what verse 13 says. Consider the work of God. For who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful. But in the day of adversity, consider. Surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him. This passage, I think we really need to be careful and consider that God doesn't want every day of our life to be super up, and cheery, everything go well. And there's a reason for it. It says, so that man cannot find out anything that will come after him. In other words, it's made so we can't just say, I know I'm going to experience good all my life, and I'm going to do this, and everything's always going to be getting better. I'm just going to keep prospering. God has made this to humble us, that he's made good days and bad days that we have to face to kind of help us keep the right perspective. And in chapter 9, check out verses 11 and 12. He says, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. Now, here's a good question. Who would win a race? You think, the swift person would win a race, and the strongest people, the warriors of the battle, those would be the ones who win. And the people who are really wise and understanding, those should be the people that do good in their work and they prosper the most. And that the people who are really skilled, those are the people that would be favored the most. But he says that's not the way it works in life. He says time and chance happen to them all. In other words, you can prepare all you want to for life and do as much good as you want. But sometimes time and chance will overtake you and you will not be ready for it. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. In verse 12, he says, for man also does not know his time, like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare. So the sons of men are snared in an evil time, when it falls suddenly upon them. And you can imagine a little fish swimming through the sea. It thinks it's going to keep going and living a good long life. But then suddenly it's coming up by the net and it's sort of flopping around once it gets up on the water. The fish didn't anticipate that happening that day. And same thing with the bird. Maybe it thought it was going to get a little worm on the ground, and suddenly it's in this snare, doesn't know what's happening. It's saying it kind of happens the same way to us. We may be anticipating what's going to happen long in life and good, happy events, sort of reasonably so. But then something horrible happens to us, and our time's gone like that. So no preparation we can do can stop something evil befalling us. And also, if we go back to chapter 3, in verse 16, not only just about our own preparation, if we just kind of look at the way things are going with other people and the kinds of things that are happening in the world around us, we'll also see some things that trouble us. Like it says in verse 16 of chapter 3, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. And I can't help but think of the government and everyone's concern with that, saying, well, if someone is leading our country, they should be doing just things and righteous things. There shouldn't be wickedness and evil there. And we're right. It shouldn't. But at the same time, it doesn't just change the fact that that's how it is. That there's a lot of things where there's going to be a lack of justice that we see in this world. And there's going to be this lack of righteousness where it should be. And then, to kind of take that, I guess, a little more personally, we can look at chapter 8 and verse 14. He says, there is a vanity which occurs on earth, that there are just men to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. Again, there are wicked men to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity. So consider that for a second. I think it's more common for people to say, if I live my life really well and I try to serve God, things are just going to be better for me in this world. I'm not going to have to worry about these problems because I'm a more righteous person, so I don't have to worry about these things. It wouldn't be as fitting for them to happen to me. And I can just talk about, and you all know people too, that something terrible happens to someone that's a godly person, and you wonder, why did it befall them? Why them? Why not this horrible person over here who's, ruining people's lives and doing all this evil? Why is it these righteous people experiencing these horrible things? And then on the flip hand, it talks about wicked people being blessed. You can look at wicked people and say, well, how are they getting that kind of wealth? And why are they so liked and supported? And you could just sit there and scratch your head and just be in awe at the things that are messed up with it. And finally, if we look over, leave Ecclesiastes, go to James, it's just really, I say this to really just try to drive the point home that we don't have the power of life. If you look in James chapter 4, I'm going to be looking at verse 13. This is a familiar passage to most. It says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, and make a profit. That sounds like a reasonable kind of plan, that we want to go and we have this good plan laid out for us and how after a year's time we'll be better than we were before. But he says in verse 14, whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and vanishes away. You could be boiling a pot of water and see how quick a little vapor comes up and it's gone. It says, you're like that little vapor. So how can you look a year into the future and say, I'm going to do this and this is how things are going to go for me? We don't know that. And then in verse 15 it says, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. To say, and this really strikes home with me, it doesn't just say it's kind of unwise to do it. It says it's arrogant to do it. To assume that we can just look so far in our life and say, this is going to happen. I can control my life. I know what's going to happen. Things are going to turn out this way for me. It says that's arrogant. We don't need to be like that. We don't need to be so boastful. We need to say, well, maybe the Lord will let me get to experience that. I can go ahead and plan. And, if God wills for me to keep going like that, I'll do it and enjoy those things. but we still have to keep that in perspective of the uncertainty of life, the unfair nature of life. And so a lot of people would arrive at this point and it'd be like, well, life's just a horrible place. And they'll be devoid of hope. And they'll say, well, I just don't see the point of it. And even, I didn't go over it, but even Solomon in Ecclesiastes, he says if you don't have a God-fearing perspective, if you just think about all the things wrong in the world, he says a stillborn baby's better off in some of the things people go through. It's like they'd be better off not being born than have to suffer all the things they've suffered. If our perspective of life is just about what we get here, then that's not going to take us very far. We're going to find there's a lot of things wrong with that. We're going to be really empty and really wondering, why is this all there is? What else is out there? And why can't I get it? So here's some perspectives that I think will be helpful for us. One is that we should be serving God despite anything man suffers. So looking back in Ecclesiastes, I'm going to be checking out chapter 8 and looking at verses 12 and 13. Here he says, though a sinner does evil 100 times, and his days are prolonged, yet I surely know that it will be well with those who fear God, who fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he does not fear before God. So no matter what happens, no matter what kind of injustice we see, we can be confident to know that wickedness is going to be dealt with in the way it should be. And that people who are fearing God and seeking after him, that's going to end up being well for them in the end. And then in Romans chapter 8, verse 18, Paul says that he considers that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that will be revealed to us. Whatever you have to suffer here in this world, no matter how bad it is, no matter what kind of evils we see, that we can take all of that and then look at the good things that God has after it and say, it was so worth serving God. Even if I had to go through all of that to serve God and to be able to enjoy what he has, it was worth it. And then in Revelation 21, verse 3 and 4, there's that vision of heaven and that God's there with his people and says he's comforting them. He's wiping away every tear from their eye. He's making everything better. No matter what you've had to suffer in this life, God is going to comfort you. And so that's why we can continue through this uncertain, unfair life, knowing that it's worth it just to serve God and enjoy the reward he has. And also to remember, God will rightly deal with man's actions. If things on earth are never answered the way that we think they should be, we can be confident God's going to take care of it. If you look at the last chapter of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, in verses 13 and 14, it says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. So we might say, well, people have done these things in secret and they've been so terrible, and I never saw anything bad happen. Nothing happened about it. They got away with it. Well, we should remember God is the ultimate judge, and he will look at everything we've done, every person, and we'll have to answer for it. So I want us to conclude by going to 2 Peter chapter 3. If you'll turn over to 2 Peter chapter 3. Because we talked about, God judging everyone kind of in a general sense. We also have to consider every work we've done, he's going to judge that too. I appreciate you all being so patient with me. I know it's kind of on the longer side, but don't worry, we're almost done. I want us to look at verses 10 through 14. Here, Peter says, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. So think about that. Everything here, all that man's invested in this world, all the good things that are done, all the accomplishments, it's all going to be gone. It's all going to be burned up. And so he says in verse 11, therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. saying if all this is going to be ending one day, we talked about at the beginning, the cycle of earth sort of keeps going. God set it up that way, but there's also going to be a day where he presses the stop button, he ends it all. And so saying if we know it's all going to be gone, why would we waste our time after vain pursuits? Why would we not instead look for God and look in verse 13 for a new heaven and a new earth in which righteousness dwells? There's a lot of things wrong in this life, but in the next life, God will have a perfect place, a place that's not so messed up and tainted. It will be a place where righteousness dwells. So in verse 14, he says, "Therefore, beloved, looking forward to these things, be diligent to be found by him in peace, without spot and blameless." That should really be our pursuit. And so, though the futility of life is continually perpetuating itself, we know God's one day going to end it. So the question I want to pose to you tonight is, are you prepared for him to judge your deeds? What has your life been all about? What have you been pursuing? Are you considering your end and the fact that God's going to be looking at what you're doing and you'll have to talk to him about it one day? So don't focus on the wrong things. Don't focus on vain things that aren't going to bring you what you really need. You need to be prepared to have God meet you, and as it says, for him to meet you in peace and not in hostility. So let me tell you, there's nothing more important, guys. That's the whole duty of our lives. That's what it's all about. So we need to have that perspective in the right place. So is there anything we can do for you tonight to help you along that line? Is there something we can do, whether it's helping you obey the gospel, to know that you haven't put God as your perspective in life, and you want to do that tonight? We can help you do that. And we can assist you as God offers his salvation and grace as you obey the gospel. Rather, is there someone here maybe who has become a Christian and they've let themselves drift to the wrong things that are just unimportant and ultimately vain? You can also make that right tonight and put God back where he belongs in his proper perspective, so you can have that hope of meeting him in peace one day. If you have any kind of need tonight, you should take care of it. Please do so while we stand and sing.